Hello, I'm Robert. A shorter version of my longer, I went into a lot of detail in my longer video, fact checker, voluntary fact checker, helping if you're scared of many things. So this is to help you to understand there's no way that Russia can make significant advances in Ukraine this year, and France is not going to send troops to Ukraine, and that Ukraine will have plenty of ammunition. And first thing is that Macron is not going to send troops to Ukraine if Zelensky doesn't want them. He can't. He's not going to send thousands of French troops into Ukraine if Zelensky doesn't want them. And Zelensky has never asked for troops in Ukraine in the entire war from other countries. And then France is not going to send troops into Ukraine even if Zelensky wants it, unless all of NATO approve as well. So suppose that Zelensky and France, now this is not going to happen because France isn't really being serious, and it's pretty clear it isn't. And Zelensky is just kind of bluffing, and then Zelensky certainly doesn't want the French troops there, but he's just being polite about it. And but suppose in this impossible situation that France and Ukraine together did want French troops in Ukraine, but Germany didn't want it, then Macron would say to Olaf Scholz, it's absolutely fine, I'm going to send these troops into Ukraine, but then Russia's not going to do anything to Germany. And then Olaf Scholz would say back to President Macron, Emmanuel Macron, that we don't believe, we're not convinced in Germany, and we think that Russia will attack Germany if you send troops into Ukraine. Then, for political reasons, legally, France can send troops into Ukraine, but it's not going to do it, however confident it is, until Germany is convinced that it's safe. So that's just the way NATO works. And they only do things when they've got a consensus. When it's a thing that everyone agrees affects all of NATO. When it's something else, like intervening in somewhere like Libya or something, then they don't have to consult amongst each other. But when it involves Russia, then there's no way that Macron is going to send troops into Ukraine unless all of NATO approve. And then here's what Zelensky said: as long as Ukraine holds, the French army can stay in French territory. So that is all he has said. That's been quoted in the press anyway. And Russia's advance has been stopped. So Zelensky he's a politician, he watches his words, he's not going to interfere with with Macron's position, but he's just saying we don't need the French soldiers, in a very clear and polite way. And so if you just listen to what Zelensky asks for, and throughout the war he's been asking for the air defense, he's been looking at the F-16s, he's been looking for, first of all, HIMARS, now he wants the Taurus from Germany, Taurus missile that is very good at destroying bridges. He wants the ATACMS, because they've got a range of 300 kilometers, they can hit anywhere in Crimea. He wants air defense systems, he wants the air interceptors for the Patriot, he wants more modern tanks, above all he wants the F-16s, the fighter jets. That's what he wants, he doesn't want soldiers. So you can see that this is a lot of spin. Now this is how you tell if it's spin. So a lot of the stories that people share on Doomsday Debunked that they're scared of about this story, about this thing, they're all about the same thing. They're all claiming that France is about to send soldiers to Ukraine, and they've all got spin, massive amounts of spin. And I can tell that immediately from the title and the first paragraph. And you can develop a spin antenna, so long as you know these basic facts, then just look and see if this article mentions them. Does this article mention that Europe is stepping up to make shells and buy shells to supply Ukraine, and that Ukraine will have all the shells it needs sometime in 2025, and that Czechia is finding shells to fill the gap in 2024? If it doesn't mention that, it's spin. Now, by spin, I mean that the author is activist. It is trying to persuade the reader of something. So you there are two ways of writing an article. You can write an article where you're giving a basically intelligence briefing. Basically, you're giving them just information. And the reader is just getting information like it's an intelligence briefing. And then the other way they do it is it's spin, where they are presenting information with the aim of getting the reader to do some specific thing. And the specific thing may vary considerably, and you might not be the target reader. In most cases you won't be. The target reader might be Congress in the United States. It might be Putin. It might be governments in Europe, and trying to persuade them to find shells find equipment for Ukraine. It might be the Ukrainians to try and boost their spirits. But the target is usually not you if you're a scared person. And it's trying to persuade this reader, whoever it is, of something. And it is very clear spin when it doesn't mention lots of things on one side of the argument and it just presents the other side. So if they start saying that Russia is going to charge through Ukraine, they don't mention that the shells issue is being solved. They don't mention that Russia's economy is fine, but the Russian defense industry, that's another matter. The finance for the defense industry comes from the oil industry, not from Russia's GDP. And that is not in such a strong position. And then there's the problem of actually finding the equipment and the factory space and actually making all these shells, and Russia doesn't have enough. And it's getting them from places like North Korea. So, does it mention that? If not, it's spin. Does it mention the way that the decades-old NATO equipment is going through the most modern S-400 air defense system and even destroying that air defense system? And that the Patriot air defense system is destroying the most modern, is stopping the most modern, supposedly unstoppable hypersonic missiles, and they're being stopped by Patriot. Even though Putin boasted that nothing can stop them. And does this article mention that? If not, it's spin. And then it tells you that Russia will suddenly take over much of Ukraine. Now, a lot of this spin is actually from the Institute of Study of War. So, I mean, not a lot of articles, but a certain level of spin in quite a few of the articles. An entire article that was clearly directed towards the US House of Congress. It ended at the end. The last sentence was a call to action. And this is a very clear case of spin. It's when it ends with what they call a call for action at the end, where they say at the end what they want the reader to do. And at the end of this article it said that the House of Congress, the House in Congress needs to vote for the Ukraine bill. So that was and all through the article it gave this impression that Russia is about to start charging through Ukraine. And it said that it desperately needs funding in order to stop Russia. And this is a very, very clear case of spin from the Institute of Study of War. And it had the call to action at the end, which shows exactly why they wrote it. So that's an example of spin. And now, if you go and look at the more detailed analysis, then they say that Russia can't cross the Oskol River to the main city of Kupiansk. It can't push much beyond Avdiivka, a little way, not very far. It never even suggests an advance in this direction, and there's no possibility of crossing the Dnieper River. So how's it going to start taking large areas of Kharkiv Oblast? How is it going to advance with Odessa? It's ridiculous. It's not going to do it. And then, if you look at the entire advance in 2022 to 23, 23 to 24, so this little dip here is the dip that Ukraine made. And the two dips there have been filled out, you can't actually see, but which were done by Russia. And those are the main changes in that entire front line from fall 2022 all the way through to today. And the rest has just stayed the same. And so Russia's huge advances that it claims, you can barely see on the map at this scale. And then bear in mind that most of Ukraine is at peace, in the sense that they're not actually people fighting there. If you're in somewhere like Dnipro, like Kherson city, then you get shells fired over from the other side by the Russians. And same there. Kharkiv though is far enough from the front line, it doesn't get the shells anymore. Just very rare, very long distance missiles. And then Kiev also, and Kiev is protected by the Patriot all the time. And then there's another one that is moved around. So different cities will be protected by at different times. And there's a third one that is probably used along the front line, in various positions along the front line. And the air defense, the Patriot system is very good. There are lots and lots of other smaller ones as well all over Ukraine. And as a result of these air defenses, the Ukraine is in a far, far safer position. And much of Ukraine, it's just like anywhere else. The people are enjoying their times, museums and things and shops, and everything is going on much as it does. And that is an important part. It's very important to Ukraine to keep their society functioning and try to attract Ukrainians to stay in Ukraine and return to Ukraine. So the fighting is just a fifth of Ukraine. The rest is pretty much like you could go and visit Ukraine and it wouldn't be much different from visiting somewhere else in Europe. And your risk from a shell would be very low. We've had all these politicians, like Macron and so on, and try to go over to Ukraine. They're not a serious risk. So remember, and then just think around you how much kindness there is in your life. This is just a tiny detail of the entire world, what I'm about to explain here. So now, this goes in a little bit more detail. I talk a bit much longer in a longer video, but this is about how, though not much change along the front line, that Russia is in a far worse position. It can't fly its command posts over the Azov Sea anymore, and its fighter jets are rather archaic, and the Russian fighter jets don't we need a command station, a command post, an airborne command post, in order to fight effectively. And both the fighter jets and the command posts can't come close to the front line anymore. And this caused quite a lot of problems to Russia. And then the minefields were washed away by Novakova Dam, which gives Ukraine a couple of footholds there, and it's got this foothold here, but it got actually through the Russian minefield. And so Russia is actually, as it goes into Ukraine, as it goes into 2024, in 2023 it had these vast, very deep minefields which Ukraine didn't know about. It didn't know how deep they were. It knew about them, it didn't know how effective they were, because Russia had a very good general, Surovikin, who built these fortifications. But Putin doesn't like competent generals, because they become too popular, and he feels threatened by them. So he fired Surovikin. And when we come into 23 to 24, Russia has not been doing these defense, hasn't been building up its defense anymore. It's been attacking Avdiivka, and it just didn't build these defenses this year. So the Ukraine comes into 2024 in a much stronger position than in 2023, because it's through the Russian front lines here, and Russia hasn't done anything to heal it. And so it's all ready to start a big counteroffensive there, another one there. It would possibly do another one up there somewhere. And then there are probably many other places that they know about. So anyway, this is about how Ukrainians, this is one of the things that these people, they just don't mention, that go down here, Germany, Norway, France, Italy, Greece, Czechia and Finland, and a total of 15 countries altogether, but those are the main ones, are involved in a big ramp up in making shells for Ukraine. But it takes time to build up these capabilities. They will have 1.4 to 1.7 million by the end of 2024. They will be 2 million a year by early 2026. As we go into 2026, Ukraine needs 2.4 million a year, and they'll all be supplied from Europe at some point in 2026. So Europe is stepping up, but it needs to make through to the end, and then Ukraine is producing its own shells on top of that. It doesn't disclose how many it produces. It's got $7 billion a year, and some amount of that is being used to make its own shells, but it doesn't tell us how many. So this though left a gap in 2024, and the main sources are South Korea, Pakistan and India are the main places that make the same shells that NATO uses. And Czechia has found 1.5 million shells that it can get from those countries, and that is enough to see over the gap for 2024. So essentially, it's on its way to being solved. It needs funding for those an extra 1 million shells, which is about $2 billion. It already has funding for 500,000 of them, and the first few will be arriving in Ukraine within weeks. So the shell problem is essentially solved. And then there's loads of other military funding, and the US has $4.2 billion in presidential drawdown. It's nothing like the 60 billions, but it's got 4.2 billion that it can use if this bill doesn't go through, that it can still use to supply equipment to Ukraine. And then Europe has 26.8 billion, no, 22.3 billion that it can use. And US just found an extra 300 million for a new package that is sent to Ukraine just by looking for pocket change, essentially, that the defense industry had spare. And it managed to find $300 million of pocket change that it's using to send to Ukraine with its ATACMS, bits of leftover money that it can send to Ukraine. And then Europe is stepping up and is committed on to Ukraine for the long haul. And we've got Germany, UK, I've listed some of the countries and regions that are very much strongly committed to Ukraine. And then Ukraine needs far more shells than Russia needs far more shells than Ukraine, because the way it just flattens everything. It completely flattens. It's the prize of Ukraine in East Ukraine is the industry, but Russia, as it advances through the cities, destroys the industry. So it's really rather bizarre. It's advancing on a region which it should be prizing for its industry, but it's destroying its industry as it advances through it. And in order to do that, it needs loads and loads of shells. It destroys them because that's the only way it knows to fight. And so it fights Ukrainian soldiers hide in the Azov steelworks, and Russia then flattens the Azov steelworks. And that's basically how they fight. Whereas Ukraine is much more subtle, and it managed to regain Kherson City without a fight. It regained a huge area of Kharkiv Oblast basically by just charging at Russia with it, getting it by surprise. And then it didn't do it by shelling cities or villages at all. It basically surprised the Russians and got them out of it that way. And Ukraine, all the way through, it's very subtle and careful, and it won the Battle of Kiev in the same way. It destroyed the Russian supply for all the tanks in Kiev. It didn't need to go bombing away, and it didn't have the capability really to do that back then. But it still won that battle. So that's the way that. So the shells matter much more to Russia than they do to Ukraine. Ukraine uses far fewer of them. So when you get people comparing the numbers of shells, and they say that Ukraine is 200,000 a month, and they say some bigger figure for Russia, remember that Russia needs far, far more, because the way it uses them is much less skillful. Then we're not going to get anything like the Russian rapid advance in spring 2022. That was because Ukraine had ancient equipment from the 1980s. And it just didn't have anything even remotely like the Russian modern Russian equipment, the modern Russian tanks, the modern Russian fighter jets. It was rather remarkable the way that Ukraine was able to stop them. It just had the Javelin anti-tank missiles from NATO and the Stinger anti, which were good for fighting, for shooting down low-flying helicopters and low-flying fighter jets. That's all it had, and not very many of them, by way of modern equipment, and not so very ancient equipment from the Soviet Union days. And it had its modern Neptunes that it developed, but that was only later on, not straight away at the moment of the invasion. So that's why Russia advanced so rapidly in spring 2022. It's no way it can do that again, because Ukraine now has modern NATO equipment, which is just as good as the modern Russian equipment. Not even modern, ancient 1980s NATO equipment is equivalent to modern Russian equipment. Ukraine is not short of soldiers. All that talk about 400,000 soldiers, it's about repaying soldiers when they retire. Replacing soldiers when they retire. They want the soldiers to have an option to retire when, after 3 years of service in 2025. In order to do that, they will have to start training new Russian soldiers, about 400,000 in starting in sometime in the summer, because it takes about 6 months to train them. So that's all that is about. They're not short of soldiers. Ukraine has 1 million soldiers, and it has most of the young men in Ukraine are not soldiers. It still has large amounts of soldiers that it could conscript if it wanted to. So Ukraine does not want soldiers from other countries. And for the foreign fighters, it does welcome foreign fighters so long it no longer welcomes the wide range of fighters it welcomed in 2022 in the very early days of conscription. They have to have had combat experience in actual war to be accepted by Ukraine nowadays. In actual war somewhere else in the world. So Ukraine is not short of soldiers. It's very picky about the people it accepts from outside Ukraine. So the reason it's on the defensive in winter is because in winter in Ukraine, most of Ukraine is like deep, deep, deep mud, and the tanks can't drive off the roads. So Russia advances very in a way that is very, very risky for its tanks, because they just drive along the roads, and then they lose about 10 tanks for every 1 tank the Ukrainians lost with Avdiivka. But the Ukrainians are not going to do counter-offensive in those conditions, because they can't afford to lose hundreds of tanks. So that is why Ukraine is on defensive every winter, and then the only time it could do a counter-offensive is when it's really, really cold and absolutely freezing, and then there's a big risk of frostbite. And in 2022-3, a number of enthusiasts were sort of saying, well, look, this is a week when there's deep freeze forecast in Luhansk, and maybe Ukraine is going to do a big counter-offensive, but it never did. So it seems that Ukraine doesn't want to fight in winter, probably because of the risk of frostbite and hypothermia for its soldiers. So you could go to sleep in the fall and then wake up in April, and you can guarantee that Ukraine won't have done a big counter-offensive. It seems to have settled into this rhythm, and Russia will have advanced very, very slowly in some small detail of its front line, because that's what it does in winter. And the change, when you wake up from hibernation in April and you go and look at the map, then there will be some tiny, tiny detail that Russia has managed to straighten out, which you wouldn't even hardly be able to pick out on a large-scale map of Ukraine. And that's what it was, both of these winters. And so based on this, it's absolutely clear that Russia is not going to invade NATO. Because remember, Ukraine is far, far weaker than any NATO country, even today. NATO only doesn't give it its best equipment. here's some of the equipment that it doesn't send. So first of all, it's about how superior the NATO equipment is, even ancient NATO equipment. The S-400 is the most modern Russian air defense system, and turned out to be just hopeless against the NATO equipment. So just using not the most ultra-modern NATO missiles, then Ukraine started destroying these S-400s. First of all in Crimea, and then in Luhansk. So it's been firing the HIMARS through them much earlier in the war, and in the fall of 2022. And then in the fall of 2023 it started destroying them. And then the Patriot air defense system, which shoots down 100% of Putin's allegedly unstoppable hypersonic cruise missile. He made a big thing about it. And it's very embarrassing for him that he said that this missile just can't be stopped, and Patriot stops them all. And except when Russia overwhelmed, it managed to save up a hodgepodge of a whole lot of different missiles for several months, and on 29th of December it managed for the first time for quite a while to get several missiles through the Patriot air defense systems of Kiev, just by overloading it, because once it's fired off all its air interceptors, they then have to reload. There's a little bit of a gap before it reloads the next load of air defenses, air interceptors, and Russia managed to get some missiles through while it was reloading. But it had to save up missiles. I don't think it got the hypersonic ones through, I'm not quite sure. Or maybe it did, I can't remember now. But it had to save up missiles for several months in order to do that on the 29th of December. It wasn't able to repeat it again. So if there was a big war between Russia and NATO, and say it wanted to, then it would be able to, every few months, saving up all its missiles just for this and not doing anything else with its missiles, then it would be able to get a few missiles through one NATO air defense system. And then would have to save up all its missiles for another few months before trying to get them through another one. It wouldn't destroy the Patriot system, but it would manage to get through and kill a few civilians and maybe damage a bit of infrastructure. So this is clearly not a country that is going to be able to fight with NATO, completely irrespective of anything to do with nukes. And then its fighter jets are 5th generation NATO's fighter jets. And you think, well, 4.5, 5, what's the difference? But it's a huge difference. 5th generation is built from the bottom up to be almost invisible to radar. It's just got a tiny, tiny cross section. It just looks like a tiny little thing. It doesn't look like a big airplane on radar. It just looks like some tiny little thing like a bird or something. And in addition, each F-35 is its own airborne command station. So I talked about how Ukraine is shooting down the Russian airborne command stations because their fighter jets need them. F-35 doesn't need that. F-35 does everything itself. One F-35 by itself can do everything that is needed. It can spot an air defense system that is looking at it, trying to spot it. Before it can spot it, then it will work out where it is using its own radar and all its own equipment. And just the one pilot of the F-35 just doing everything. Then he will just say, well, I'll sort out this. Oh, okay, there's their thing. But let's set it going. It's all very easy controls, and it will then work out how to fire a missile, and then just press a button, and that missile goes and destroy the air defense system. And the F-35 can do that all by itself. And the Russian air, and so the F-35, this is an F-35 pilot called Billy Flynn, and that was April 2022, I think. He said the F-35 would see all the air-to-air threats and kill them all, and completely neutralize the surface-to-air missile threat. And in a parallel world, he says, we are not going to do this, but in a parallel world, then if the F-35 would completely destroy Russian forces from the air. it would be like, and he said it's like playing football. He'd be talking about American football, and imagine that your team is invisible. Then you would have a bit of an advantage in a game of football. Indeed, I can't imagine that the other team would get any goals at all if your team was invisible. Your team can all see each other, but the other team can't see you. Then you would have a huge advantage, wouldn't you? And also, in addition to this, as Professor Philip O'Brien explained about this in 2022, the experts, independent experts like himself, were expecting Russia to take over the Ukrainian airspace very early in the war and suppress the Ukrainian military from above. But it turned out that Russian pilots are just not trained to do that. They're only used to fighting countries that don't have their own air force, their own fighter jets. They're not used to fighting a country that has fighter jets with pilots as capable as them. And they simply haven't trained to do that. And the Ukrainian fighters turned out to be far more adaptable and far better pilots than the Ukrainians, than the Russians. And the Russians are incredibly inflexible. In that article, Philip O'Brien talks about how they behave much like the pilots in World War II who were told, go and drop a bomb at such and such a point. And they don't look for targets of opportunity. They go, if you're in a Ukrainian convoy in daytime and you see a Russian fighter jet fly overhead, you don't need to worry that they might drop a shell on you, because they don't have the initiative. They're not permitted to do that. So Ukraine is able to supply its convoys traveling around in daytime, and the NATO partners, they send supplies through along the railway lines and through Ukraine from Poland. They used to take quite a lot of precautions, but gradually, especially with Patriot now, they really don't need to worry at all. But it just became very clear that Russia is no good. It's just not capable of stopping them. It just doesn't pay much attention to these convoys, and it just not precise enough, and they don't have the autonomy to do it. And then the Ukrainians just took over all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians, the airspace above the land that the Ukrainian soldiers occupy and that they have control of is completely under the control of Ukraine. And Russia no longer dares to fly over it. Especially now they've got Patriot. But even in 2022, it wasn't far into the war before Russia just was stopping flying over the Ukrainian territory anymore. And this is really bizarre, because as Professor O'Brien explained, that they have about 4,000 combat aircraft in Russia. Even with 4,000 combat aircraft, and I'm not sure how many Ukraine has. I think is it 50 or something? It doesn't have a huge number of MiG-24 fighter jets. But the Russians just couldn't take over. They just didn't know how to use all its fighter jets to take over the airspace of Ukraine, because the pilots just aren't trained to do it. So this was very bizarre to NATO experts watching this, that Russia, with its thousands of fighter jets and combat aircraft of various types, was just not able to take over the Ukrainian airspace. And so the NATO fighter jets are far superior to Ukraine. The way that NATO fights is far superior to the way that Russia fights. The NATO air is far superior to the Russian air, and in a modern war, the country that's got control of the air has got the superiority, and there's no point in tanks advancing if the opposing force has got complete control of the air over you. And then Russia can't win with its nukes. It just simply hasn't got enough. It hasn't got enough for one nuke for every military base. And a nuke would not be enough to make, and that's every base of just United States, United Kingdom, leaving out France, Germany, the Baltic States, Netherlands, the Canada, etc. It's not good enough for just United States and United Kingdom for just one nuke for each base, assuming it did completely ignored the ICBMs and didn't target any of the ICBMs with its nukes, but only targeted the military bases. It still hasn't got enough. And then it can't target all the ICBMs. It can't do anything about the nukes on subs. And then you've got all the destroyers and all the things at sea, and you've got all the fighter jets, and you've got underground hangars for fighters and so on. And there's just no way that Ukraine, Russia, it's just a fantasy. This idea that Russia could win a war with the nukes, it couldn't. So that's just a fantasy. The Soviet Union's never had that capability. The United States has never had that capability. NATO has never had that capability either. Nukes are just not the fantasy weapon that people make them out to be. So there's absolutely no risk of a world war, and it's very rare to find anyone. The main person I've found, and kudos to him for saying it, is Admiral Radakin, who's the chief of the UK Armed Forces. And he is very concerned by the way that the sensationalist headlines are scaring people. And he says there's nothing to be scared of. He says Britain is safe. We're safe because we're part of NATO, and because we're responsible for nuclear power. And he says the biggest reason that Putin doesn't want a conflict with NATO is because Russia will lose, and lose quickly, just as I explained. And not lose quickly through nukes, lose quickly through conventional means. They would have lost control of the Russian airspace the next day with the F-35s if they started a war with NATO. Then NATO planes would be flying anywhere over Russia and destroying anything in like from the air by the next day, within hours. And the Tomahawk cruise missiles would be flying right across through the air defense systems throughout Russia. And so he talks about how I've explained Radakin, and this is quite a recent one, but it's after they managed to get Avdiivka, and he talked about it just 40 square kilometers took 9 months, 29 square kilometers took 5 months, and 70,000 Russian lives and over 30,000 injured, according to the UK intelligence. So that is, there's no way that given that is Russia escalating to its absolute max, there's no way that is a credible something that NATO needs to worry about. So then I talk a little bit about some of the reasons why NATO might be so downplaying its abilities. I think that's mid-edit because I said I'd do 4, but there are only 2. I need to rethink about what I would do there. But and then this is about how Ukraine has got very obvious counteroffensives that it could do. And so what it's really about this summer is, will Ukraine do a big counteroffensive against Russia, or will it just try small ones? It seems pretty clear that once the fighting season starts, once it makes sense to advance, once the tanks can drive off the roads, once it's possible for the infantry fighting vehicles and the entire army to just drive wherever it wants, then at that point, then we'll see whether Ukraine feels it's ready already to do the counteroffensives. It'll have the F-16s, and the F-16s will bring it's nothing like the F-35s, but the F-16s will give Ukraine capabilities similar to the Russian most modern fighter jets. And given that the Ukrainian pilots are clearly hugely superior to the Russian pilots, given that 50 or whatever number of fighter jets have held off 4,000 for the entire war, then what's going to happen when they've got a few fighter jets that have the same capability, and ancient ones, MiG-29s, that have the same level of capability as the best Russian fighter jets? Then what's that going to do? And I mean, doesn't mean that there's no way that Ukraine would take over the Russian airspace, the occupied Ukraine airspace. It's not that much of an advantage, but it's enough of an advantage so they would probably be able to support an advance of a counter-offensive from the air in a way that they couldn't do before they had the F-16s. So you can understand why they'd be waiting for the F-16s before doing counter-offensives. And so that's something that seems quite likely for this year. If not this year, then next year. But if the US bill came through, then what it's really about is if the US bill comes through, Ukraine could do huge counter-offensives this year. If it doesn't come through, then it might do small, it will probably do at least some counter-offensives. They might be quite small ones, like outposts there, an outpost there, an outpost there. These are three possibilities. There are probably dozens, half a dozen or more ideas that Ukraine has in mind. Those are very obvious ones that have been talked over and over again on Twitter. Not giving away any secrets by anyone to mention those three. And the Russian generals are completely dim not to have focused on stopping those counteroffensives. So the Russians should have built their air defense, spent the entire winter, and they haven't done it, and it's too late now, building defences there and pushing Ukraine back there. So we'll see what happens in the summer. So that's it. That's my shorter version of this video, and I'll upload this. So hopefully that you'll be this helps some of you from being a bit less scared and to be a little bit more skeptical, and to hopefully to be able to recognize spin a bit better in the articles that you've been sharing on the Facebook group, where sadly a lot of people have got rather scared by the spin, and that is why I did this video, to hopefully help some of you to be more understand how to be more critical of these articles, and improve your critical thinking, and to recognize the spin, and why I'm saying the way I'm talking is so different from the articles. Because the reason is because I'm only doing this to help scared people. The articles you're reading, they are being written to try and persuade the reader in one direction or the other. Persuade Putin, try to persuade NATO, try to persuade the Congress, try to persuade the governments of Europe, and the ISW, it's not neutral. It's got spin, and it's trying to trying to persuade the reader of various things. And I'm not trying to persuade the reader of anything political or anything military. I'm just trying to help people who are scared to understand that there's no risk of a world war. And there's very few people who are actually writing like this. I don't think you'll find any articles just written to help scared people in the mainstream press. That is why what I'm saying is so different from what you read, because that's my only objective, is to help people who are scared. So that is why I'm presenting things very differently from most of the sources that you read. So hopefully this helps you understand. And this is only for scared people that I'm doing this. I have no other objective except to help people who've been panicked by all these ridiculous spin to no longer be scared. That's the only reason I've done this video.